So hi everybody, thanks for tuning in to another bit of a technical video. Shouldn't be too long on this video really, but I just wanted to draw this video purely to kind of show how I've stitched together a few of the technologies now to actually build and create a Docker container, publish that container into Azure Container Registry, and then obviously have that container deployed into something like an Azure Web App Service plan and an Azure Web App Service. Part of this video is really based on a blog article, so let me just flick over to my desktop a second. The idea is that if you've been familiar with my recent blog articles, you can see that I blogged about how you manually create these things to create the container using Docker and Dockerfile and Docker Compose files, then take that container image and push that into an Azure Container Registry using command line, from your Docker console or your terminal window. The idea behind this blog post now is to really look to automate that process using Azure DevOps and Azure DevOps build pipelines. And in doing so, just showing really how, just a basic way that you can hook in an Azure web app into using that container image to display the application from an internet perspective. So this is a blog post. The link for this is below. You can follow along with this video in that blog post. So it's really just a quick overview of how you can get some of these things working and just show you a few differences between sort of using the classic pipeline editor in Azure DevOps versus using the YAML file, and I can quickly show you a few things about that. So if you're not familiar with the series, this is all started off by an original blog post and previous video creating a Blazor WASM app running in a Docker container to control my robot arm, which I'll get on the screen in a second when we get this all working. I went on then to do another blog post really about how do we push that Docker image, that container image, into Azure Container Registry. Now this video and this blog post is going to extend that now essentially to use our same Docker Compose YAML file to publish that Blazor WASM application into a container, but we're going to use that Azure DevOps pipeline, that build pipeline, to do that automated process. And we'll run through it. It does take a little bit of time to run through, but again, I'll do it in real time and we'll talk around a few things as we're going. So obviously we can use ADO to tag the image appropriately. I've tried to keep it as simple as possible in this video, where we I'm just going to use the default latest for the image that I'm going to create within Azure DevOps Pipelines. So without further ado, let's jump on over into my Azure portal. So you can see, I've browsed. I've already pre-created this Johnny Chips ACR resource group, and if you remember from the last blog post, it was the manual creation of our Azure Container Registry. So I've got this Johnny Chips ACR 001, which is my Azure Container Registry. Currently I've got one repo in there and it's called Johnny Chips Blazor WASM. By rights I could remove that, and in fact I'll delete that repository for the purposes of this exercise now. So you can see I've effectively got an Azure Container Registry. There's no repository in there at the minute, and certainly no images. So on that note, you'll recall, and if you don't, you can check the previous blog post or you can check it out here. I've got my VS Code here, and I've got a local copy of essentially that Blazor WASM application. It's here, it's stored locally on my machine. This is a cloned Git repo that is stored in my GitHub repo, which we'll get onto in a second. I've then got a second window open which contains the firmware. You can see I'm remote SSH'd into my Raspberry Pi, which is sat just by the side of me here. Essentially, the background to this then is that if we jump on over into Azure DevOps, I've already set up a project called Robot Arm. If we click into that project, you'll see that I have got currently two build pipelines in there at the moment. One appears to be running, which I'm going to click on and cancel out of that if it is running, because I've just checked something into my repo. So I'm going to can that off for a second. Yeah, I will delete that completely. And so you can see, basically I've got this pipeline was built using the classic GitHub GUI editor of the pipeline, essentially. I mean, we can click into it and we can have a quick look at it just to kind of get a bit of a feel as to what this is doing. But essentially, all it's really doing is it's running two commands, for want of a better phrase. It's hooking into my Johnny Chips Blazor web app GitHub repo. Yeah. We're checking it out from the master branch. We are then running, our agent job is running a Docker Compose, which is essentially choosing that Docker Compose YAML file, which to view that is this file here, which is essentially just going to pull my container image up, bootstrap it up. It's going to use the Docker file from my server application to basically build and publish that as an image, and it's going to store that. Again, I'm not going to dwell on the details. Check out the previous video, the previous blog post on that, and you can see exactly the details on that one. We're not going to do anything funky or fresh with this one. You can see compared to previous, when we run this using the Docker Compose, the up command, and we build it, that basically pulls our image up and then it runs it in a container. We don't want that container image to start, so we use the additional sort of command parameter no start, which essentially just builds the image and it holds it there in memory for us to do something with, which is the next task. And the next task is to push that image to our Azure Container Registry. So it's there and it's available for use by another process. So that's the view in the classic pipeline. If we flick over to our YAML file, again, it's stored. I've got it stored in the roots of that GitHub repo. So we just got it called build pipeline. You can see essentially we've got a single job, much like the classic editor. We've got a Docker Compose command, which is running those build no starts, and we've got then the second task of Docker Compose, which is push the services, and it's essentially going to be pushing the services to my Azure Container Registry, repository container. So I mean that's fundamentally it when it comes to completing that. Like I say, you can follow along in that blog article, and what I'm going to do, I'm going to pull this over to my other window so I can just quickly scroll down. So the first thing then is you can see we've used this YAML file here to essentially build our create our build pipeline. It's a single job, single agent job. It's running on Ubuntu 20.04, and we've effectively got two tasks. Yeah, we've got the first one that runs our Docker Compose, which builds our containers and it builds our image from the images that are specified in that Docker Compose file here, and that Docker Compose file is there, so you can see. And then essentially after that task, we are pushing that image into Azure Container Registry. So we're going to use the ADO pipeline to do that. Now, the way that I've got the pipeline triggered at the moment is that, if we quickly edit this pipeline, again, you can see that this is essentially stored. It's just putting it from my GitHub repo. You can see that the trigger I've got is when we check in to the master branch. Okay, so I could run this manually, or I could do a change in my repo. I'm going to run this manually, and we'll walk it through so we can see exactly what's going down. So this does take a little while to complete, so I might flick back and forth, but for now, we'll click on it. It's queued for the minute. Hopefully it won't take too long to get picked up. It doesn't normally, but on occasion when you queue an agent job, it can sit there for a minute or two until it gets picked up. So we'll just leave that run for the time being. Like I say, it's really running through all the same processes that we ran in the previous video, but essentially it's running it now on a hosted agent in Azure DevOps, so it's automating that process. So I'm going to pause the video there for a second, and we'll come back when that's done. So there we go. The agent job's just finished. I did have to kick that off again. It took so long, so I just cancelled it and started it just with a commit into the GitHub repo. But we can see that we've gone through the checkout. We've got all the code from the GitHub repo. We've run that Docker Compose task where you can see that it's obviously downloaded all the relevant Docker images to build and publish my Blazor WASM app. And we've got that completed. Then we've taken that image and we've pushed it into my Azure Container Registry. So we flick over to back to the Azure portal and just give that a quick refresh, we can see we've got my Johnny Chips-Blazor WASM repo, and there we go. We can see we've got an image with a tag of latest there. So essentially that pipeline has now run, and that pipeline will run on the checking in of any code into my GitHub repo. So it will kick that off and it'll run. So effectively, whenever I change any code in my master branch of my repo, that will kick off. Obviously, you know, you wouldn't necessarily do that in real life. You might have that check into another branch and create a pull request and use that as the trigger to publish. But essentially, you can see the basic task that it's doing. Again, with the tagging of the container, you might want to add in, you know, just use the build variable to give the tag of the actual build, the run of the pipeline to that image. So essentially, you get a collection of images over time, you know, maybe for each build or whatever it may be to suit your particular needs. So on that note, we've got our first run of our pipeline. So we've got that created, we've got that container created and published into our Azure Container Registry. Sorry, that image. The next thing that we're going to want to do is actually create our app service. So, I mean, I'm going to do this through the portal. Obviously, we could script it. We could do anything we like. So the first thing I'm going to do is jump on over to App Services. I'm going to create a new app service. I'm going to give it some, I'm just going to use my existing container registry resource group. I'm going to give it the name of Johnny Chips Web App 01. Yeah, WA01. And we're going to select this option now. So we're going to use a Docker container. Now it's on a Linux OS. I use the Ubuntu build. It's running on Alpine, I believe, is the image that it's finally ending up on. I'm going to put this in UK South, which is close to where I've got all my resources at the moment. I'm going to let it create its own new. I'm not too worried about this, so it's going to create that. I am going to change the SKU, because I don't want to be paying for a premium SKU. I'm just going to use the dev test and F1 primarily because it's a free service plan. I'm not going to be doing anything fantastic at the moment with it. Give that an apply. The next, we're going to select our container. So we've got, you can use a Docker Compose, which is in preview, and we're not going to do that for this example. We're just going to select single container, and we're going to select that it's from my Azure Container Registry. ACR 001. Right, at this stage, you might get a little pop-up saying that the admin permissions on the container registry have been removed. If you look in the blog article, there's a link to how you enable them. You can do it through the GUI through Azure Container Registry. Just stick that little radio button on just to allow the admin rights into that ACR. Right, so I'm going to take it from my Blazor WASM image. I'm going to use the tag of latest. And that's about it. I'm not going to be too concerned at the moment with things like monitoring. I'm just going to click review and curate at that stage. It's gone through the initial pass, and that's great. So we'll click on create. Again, this is going to take a few moments to get that created for me. So whilst that's in progress, I'm going to pause and we'll come back in a second. And there we go. So we have our deployment completed. So let's go to my resource now. So in theory, I've just spun up an app service plan with an app service, a default slot. I've not done anything with dev slots or anything like that. There's lots of good things that you can do, obviously, in production terms, in terms of creating multiple slots. I think on the F1, the free plan, you can only have the one slot, but this is purely just for testing purposes. So with that spun up, we get this URL. Now, if I copy that URL and paste that in the window here, it might take a little bit of time to get started first time round. And there we go. So, you know, that took a little bit of time to start up there. I did pause and come back to it. But first time round, when you're spinning up a web service, especially on the free plan, it's not got a huge amount of resources, and it does take a little while to start up anyway. But there's our Blazor WASM web app running. And you can see that this is now running on an externally addressable URL, the johnnychipswa01.azurewebsites.net. So effectively, I'm running that in the cloud. At the minute, I can move these things and nothing is happening, certainly not to my robot arm. But effectively, hopefully you can see that we've built and published our container image. We've put that container image into Azure Container Registry. We've then created an app service with an app service plan to use that container image to present this website. So we're all good. So on that note, the next step to do is we're going to see if we can get this actually working with our robot arm. So bring in arm cam. There it is. So you can see just on this image now, I've got in the bottom right of the image, which is the little red device with the printed circuit board just above my head there. That's my little Raspberry Pi. The little battery pack is used to connect to the Servo 6 card, this card here, to provide power for these servo motors. There's 4 servo motors in total, and you can see that corresponds with these 4 servo controllers here on the web page. So in terms of actually getting this up and running on my robot arm, we're going to flick over to my VS Code terminal. So I've already SSH'd onto my Raspberry Pi. So this device here, I'm now remoted on via this VS Code session. So I'm going to just see, I think I've got a share. So I got this share folder. So I'm going to just quickly change, and I think in there, I think I've got one called robot firmware. So in that folder is essentially all of these files here that I'm actually already showing. In our program.cs, we've got this little hub connection builder. So SignalR is the process used. It's like a chat thing, so client server response. Whenever there's a message sent by one of those controls on my my Blazor WASM web app, that gets sent and stored in this chat hub, and in turn the robot arm, the firmware, connects that chat hub to get those messages sent to it, if that makes sense. So there's this two-way connection tunnel essentially set up by SignalR between all clients that connect to this chat hub, and you can see that it just connects over HTTPS in this occasion. So in order to connect to my service here, I could probably just take that URL and I could overtype that in there, and that now is, if I save that, so save that, that's saved directly onto my Raspberry Pi. The next thing I need to do is actually run that firmware on my robot arm. So if I go .NET run, takes a few moments just to fire up, so to speak, but in a second I should get that confirmation message that my robot arm is set up and ready to be controlled. So essentially that SignalR connection is now going to be being set up. There we go, robot arm engaged. So if I go back to my little control, let's just see, moment of truth. There we go. So now what's going on is that's obviously the servo motor that moves the arm up and down. This one in and out, you can see that it controls the arm that way. This one controls the revolution, and then this little arm controls the claws. So there we go. I mean, this is pretty funky. Effectively what I've got is I've got my Blazor WASM web app assembly application packaged up into a Docker container image. That is now in Azure Container Registry. That image has been running an app service plan that is then hooked up to the firmware on my Raspberry Pi here that is enabling the chat from my service. So I could effectively use this page wherever I am, anywhere in the world. This is an externally facing URL that is now being used to control my robot arm. So on that note, I don't think there's much more to go into. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope that's given you a little bit of an incentive or just some ideas on how to kind of start using this technology to piece things together. I'm not going to stop there. I think in future videos and blog posts, I'm looking to add a few sensors, some bits and pieces, and send some of this telemetry from my robot arm into IoT Hub, and then we can just see, we can have a little play, we can see what we can do with it from there. But thanks so much for tuning in. Like I say, I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, I would be so grateful if you could like and subscribe, click on the little notification bell for future videos. Until next time, I've been John Lunn, aka Johnny Chips, and thanks so much for tuning in.